Early in my channel's life, I did a video covering semi-dreadnoughts, a classification of ship that, as the name implies, falls between dreadnoughts and pre-dreadnoughts. In that video, I touched on the Austro-Hungarian take on this concept, the Radetzky-class battleships, which exemplify the semi-dreadnought style. Faster and more heavily armed than a pre-dreadnought, but still holding to a mixed main battery. These ships were the final Austrian battleships prior to the Tegethoff, and much like those ships, their combat careers were limited to say the least. The Austro-Hungarian Navy largely kept to port during the Great War. Like the Italians they were arrayed against, there was an aversion to risking battleships in the tight confines of the Adriatic. As such, the story of the Radetzkys is more interesting for two things: their design and development process being one, and the other being the fate of two of them, Radetzky herself and her sister Zrinyi. They ended up in control of probably the last nation you expect, if only temporarily. And as a final proverbial middle finger to the Italians, who completely ignored the transfer of those ships to the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. In the end, their last act of defiance would be just that, an act of defiance. All three of the ships would ultimately end up in Italian hands, where they were scrapped in the early 1920s. That said, let's hold off on that for the moment. First, we'll go back to where the story began and look at the development of these interesting battleships. This is a story that originated in the appointment of a new head to the Austrian Navy, Admiral Rudolf Montecuccoli. He took over as the commander-in-chief of the Austro-Hungarian fleet in October 1904, and almost immediately made his mark. Montecuccoli was a forward-thinking man who had a strong desire to modernize the Austrian fleet, which, for understandable reasons, lagged behind its contemporaries. As I touched on in the Tegethoff video, Austria was a land power. Most of the funding went in that direction, in addition to political snarls caused by its dual parliament system. Anything going to the Navy had to be approved by both Austria and Hungary. In any event, the Admiral's plan took shape in 1904. He wanted a fleet of 12 modern battleships, 4 armored cruisers, 8 scout cruisers, and 18 large destroyers, supported by 36 torpedo boats and 6 submarines. The first notable result of this plan was a design for 3 new battleships, which were actually initially put forward in May 1904, before Montecuccoli had even taken his new post. This was a direct counter to the new Regina Elena-class in Italy. Fast, though relatively lightly armed and armored battleships. Though, as is often the case, the design process would take a bit to produce results. It was only in September 1905 that 5 preliminary designs were put forward. Those 5 designs differed mostly in regard to their weapon layout. Design A featured 4 28cm, 11-inch guns in 2 twin turrets, supported by 4 24cm, 9.4-inch guns in 4 wing turrets and 8 19cm, 7.5-inch guns in casemates. The main battery was the typical pre-dreadnought layout, while the secondary battery was a bit heavier than average. Design B was the same, aside from the tertiary battery. that was swapped to 12 smaller 10cm, 3.9-inch guns, while Design C broke from the usual pre-dreadnought style, opting instead for 8 28cm guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 on the center line and 2 wing turrets, with only 16 10cm guns for the secondary battery. For its part, Design D followed the same pattern, except it went for fewer but heavier guns. 6 305mm 12-inch guns, with the wing turrets dropping to 1 barrel each, while Design E, the final one, reverted back to the pre-dreadnought scheme. 4 305mm guns and 2 centerline twin turrets, supported by 8 19cm guns and 4 twin wing turrets and 12 10cm casement guns. What all of these have in common, regardless of the details, was a desire for heavy firepower, with Design C and D being all big gun layouts. Not dreadnoughts, but certainly moving in that direction. A direction that Austria-Hungary wasn't quite ready for. The ships would have been too large and expensive. As such, it would be Design E that was ultimately selected, albeit in modified form, for the new ships. That modification consisted of increasing the size of the secondary battery guns from 19cm up to 24cm, or again 9.4 inches. Partially a reaction to increasing gun caliber in foreign navies. Take, for example, the Lord Nelsons with 6 9.2-inch secondary guns. Regardless, even after the design was approved, it wouldn't immediately begin construction. Remember what I said about the funding issue? That would strike again. There simply wasn't enough money to build new ships. Because of this, in 1904 and 1905, there wasn't room in the budget for the new design. It would only be in 1906 that enough funding could be dug up for 3 new battleships. In November of 1906, to be specific, when Admiral Montecuccoli presented a budget request for 3 14,500-ton battleships. In an early sign of how this admiral was willing to work around strict rules, he basically bribed the Hungarians to get approval by promising Hungarian industry a higher proportion of naval construction. For the moment, however, it resulted in the 3 Radetzkys. With funding secured, the 3 ships could begin construction, with the second of the class, Radetzky, laid down on November 26, 1907, launched on July 3, 1909, and completed on January 15th of 1911. That wraps up the background, so let's touch on the details of the design and then move to service. The Radetzkys displaced 14,500 or so tons at their normal load, going up to around 15,850 tons when fully loaded. On that displacement, the ships carried 4 305mm 12-inch guns and 2 twin turrets, 1 on the bow and 1 on the stern, supported by 8 24cm 9.4-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 2 to a side and wing mountings, with weaponry rounded off by 20 10cm 3.9-inch guns and single casement mounts, along with the obligatory submerged torpedo tubes, 3 in this case, 2 on the broadside and 1 in the stern. Armor protection, meanwhile, came out to 230mm 9.1 inches on the main belt, narrowing down to 100mm 3.9 inches toward the bow and stern. The ships also featured a 58mm torpedo bulkhead. Their designer, Siegfried Popper, was quite insistent on underwater protection. To round off this section, the ships were capable of 20.5 knots on 19,800 indicated horsepower through 2 shafts. Now, with all of this sorted, what about the service? Well, for today, as you can tell, I'm focusing on Radetzky herself. Though for the most part, these ships had a pretty similar service history. They all entered service at the start of the 1910s, which meant only a couple years of peacetime before the Great War kicked off in 1914. Radetzky, as noted, entered service at the start of 1911, with her first notable event coming early into that service in June of 1911, when the ship was present in Britain for the coronation review of King George V. Not exactly exciting, but it is something she has over her sisters. After this, however, she joined up with the other two. All 3 of the battleships would spend the remainder of their peacetime career on training cruises. Not much to touch on, really, outside of a multinational fleet demonstration in 1912. This was to protest the Balkan Wars, and is notable mostly for Radetzky and her sisters operating seaplanes. Unfortunately, the ships weren't really designed to operate those, so this was a bit of a failed experiment. In any event, by 1914, the Tegethoffs were in service, and the Radetzkys were no longer the tip of the Austrian spear. That would have been an important note had the Austro-Hungarian fleet put its battleships to real use. When the Great War broke out in 1914, that wouldn't be the case, for the most part. I've touched on this in my Italian videos as well, but I'll note it here for completion's sake. Both the Italians and the Austrians were leery of sending out their heavy fleet units. The Adriatic was a tight sea with a lot of islands. There was a very real concern about torpedo boat attack. Needless to say, neither side was willing to risk their big, expensive battleships, especially when they lacked the resources to build more. Now, this isn't to say that Radetzky saw no combat at all, though her actions would be early in the war as a result. The first of these came in the bombardment of Cattaro. Initially, Montenegrin artillery bombarded the Austro-Hungarian port on August 8th of 1914. This was mostly countered by the old Monarch-class battleships. However, the French landed heavier guns in late September. These began to open fire on October 19th, prompting the Austrians to send in heavier guns of their own. Specifically, SMS Radetzky. She was sent out on October 21st and arrived off Cattaro on October 22nd. She would open fire later that day and continue to duel with the French guns until October 27th. Her fire would prove to be surprisingly accurate, guided by both shore spotters and observation balloons. Radetzky managed to knock out several Montenegrin and French guns over the course of the campaign, eventually forcing the Allied forces to pull back and give up on taking Cattaro, allowing the victorious Radetzky to return to port on December 16, 1914. After this, she wouldn't see combat again until May of 1915. While Italy had been neutral to this point, the Austro-Hungarian leadership wasn't blind. It was apparent which way the Italians leaned, and plans were in place should war break out, which it did, with Italy declaring war on May 23, 1915. Within hours, much of the Austro-Hungarian fleet set sail. Their target was the Italian port of Ancona, a rather famous bombardment. However, Radetzky would sail further south. She would bombard various islands instead. Either way, this would be her final combat operation. Radetzky would return to Pola and spend the rest of World War I in port or on short training cruises. She wouldn't even sail in the attempt to break the Otranto barrage in 1918. As a result, Radetzky was still in port in October 1918 when the Austro-Hungarian fleet was handed over to the new state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. This was a political move to try and keep the fleet out of Italian hands, which failed, of course, but the important note for today is this. Radetzky and her sister Zrinyi had particularly rebellious crews. While the rest of the fleet was surrendered in early November, those two battleships resisted. Radetzky set sail on November 7th, with her sister following on November 10th, with Zrinyi spotting Italian ships, upon which her crew hauled up the American flag. She promptly sailed right beyond the baffled Italians to surrender to a group of American submarine chasers. The commanders of these two battleships preferred surrendering to the United States over Italy. Conway and Austro-Hungarian battleships both cite the ships being put under American command. The latter goes a step further, citing the ships being commissioned into the United States Navy, which in fairness, the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships corroborates, at least for Zrinyi. Those two battleships were thus the first foreign battleships technically commissioned under the Stars and Stripes. However, this was short-lived. The battleships went to Italy, where they would be scrapped between 1920 and 1921. An interesting, but not surprising end. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.